Well, folks, I'm so excited to be finishing this book up that it's like the stars are against me because my phone keeps malfunctioning. So just be patient with me. I'm actually starting in the middle of a chapter this time because it kicked off in the middle of the last reading I did. Matron Bridie was talking to Mandy about spending Christmas with the Fitzgeralds and coming to get her the day after Christmas at noon. She says, "And how does that suit you?" Mandy found her voice. She spoke with emotion. "Oh, that's fine, matron, just fine. Thank you so much. Oh, golly, it's going to be such an exciting Christmas." The days sped by quickly. Mandy's health improved rapidly, though she stayed in bed most of the time. But she was busy, happily painting and drawing and cutting out cards as gifts for everyone in the house. On Christmas Eve, Mandy and Jonathan made paper chains to hang in the library where the Christmas tree was going to be. And in the early evening after dinner, Mandy was allowed downstairs to help the family with the rest of the decorations. Bill and Brendan had brought in a huge fir tree that they had cut down on the estate. It nearly touched the ceiling. Bill stood on a ladder, and the children passed up to him the tinsel and lights and ornaments. At the appropriate time, Bill signaled for everyone to stand back, and he turned off the overhead lights. Then he touched a separate switch, and the Christmas tree suddenly burst into life. Glowing and twinkling in the darkened room, it shone like a fairy tale tree. The silver and gold ornaments reflected color from the lights, and toy soldiers and gingerbread men and dancing ladies spun lazily from the branches. The sparkling angel at the very top of the tree seemed to be smiling down on everyone. They all applauded loudly. Samson served mulled wine for the grown-ups and hot chocolate for the children, and then they all sat by the fire in the darkened room and roasted marshmallows and told Christmas stories. Mandy felt suffused with happiness. She wondered what all the children at the orphanage were doing and remembered her other Christmases there. It was a surprise to discover that feeling this good, was actually a painful experience. She shut out her memories and tried to concentrate on this most wonderful time. Christmas morning was noisy and cheerful. Mandy and Jonathan received stockings filled with all manner of goodies and nonsense and sweets and fruit. Jonathan had a toy bugle in his stocking, which he insisted on blowing outside Mandy's room at a horribly early hour. He made so much noise that she laughingly hid beneath the bedcovers until he stopped. The day swung joyously from one happy moment to another. Presents were distributed to everyone. Mandy had never received such lovely gifts. Bill and Ann gave her a beautiful red dress. It had an old-fashioned white lace collar and frilly lace cuffs, and there was a pair of red shoes with silver buckles on them to go with the dress. They also gave her a tiny gold signet ring with her initials carved in it, and miraculously, it fit her third finger perfectly. Mandy vowed to herself that she would never, ever take it off. Jonathan gave her a cuddly teddy bear made of something that was as soft as a rabbit's fur. It was a dark brown bear with black eyes and a black nose, and its eyes were a deep hazel color and seemed to be looking straight at Mandy. She received books to read and crayons to color with, and she thought that no other girl in the whole world could be so lucky. At lunchtime, a light meal was served in the small dining room, and Bill told so many silly stories that Mandy and Jonathan practically slid under the table with laughter. In the afternoon, everyone slept, and later Jonathan and Bill left the ladies and went out for a walk by themselves. In the early evening, everybody dressed up in his best clothes. Mandy wore her new red dress and shoes. When everyone was ready, Anne led them all to the big formal dining room. She flung open the double doors, and everyone cried out with delight. The room was completely illuminated by candlelight. Candles were everywhere, on the tables, on the mantelpiece, and on the small pedestal tables by the window. It was a beautiful sight. Bill looked at his lovely wife and murmured, "I think you must have used up this month's and next month's allowance." Anne nodded happily. "I did, darling, but this is our first Christmas here, and I want us to remember it always." He planted a kiss on her forehead. "I somehow think we will." The turkey dinner was delicious. Afterward, Anne played carols on the organ in the library, and they all sang until they were hoarse. Finally, at a very late hour, the wonderful day came to an end, and everyone retired to bed. Long after Bill and Anne and Jonathan had said good night, Mandy lay in the darkness of her room, holding her new teddy bear close and reflecting how happy she had been the past few weeks. With a sudden shock, she realized that it was all going to be over tomorrow. Matron was coming for her at noon, and she was going to be taken back to her old life at the orphanage. It was an unbearable thought. Sadness overcame her, and though Mandy fought it with all her strength, she submitted to the worst depression of her whole life. She tried to tell herself that it was selfish to feel this way after having had such a wonderful Christmas. She was so much luckier than the other children at the orphanage, but it didn't help because, although she felt guilty, she wanted desperately for the happiness to go on. She wanted to hold on to it and keep it for always. Mandy tried to console herself with thoughts of the beautiful gifts she had received that day. She would treasure them her whole life. They would remind her of this exquisite Christmas. But why couldn't it go on? Why couldn't she stay with Bill and Anne and Jonathan forever and ever? She remembered her conversation with Anne, and Anne telling her that they weren't sure they could afford to keep Cranton House. So obviously they couldn't afford to take care of one extra person as well. And even if they could, why would they want to? It seemed to Mandy that all the good things in life had to come to an end. It had been that way with the cottage, too. She wept silent tears, and her emotions spun around and around. The night lengthened. Mandy heard the clock in the lounge chime twice. The minutes ticked away. She stared at the windows and a pinpoint of light that was the moon, and she came to a brave decision. No matter how sad she felt, she would not show her sadness to anyone. She would let Bill and Anne know that this had been the happiest time of her whole life. She would not let them see her greed and selfishness, and would leave them with as good an impression of herself as possible. She would try to be strong. Having made the decision, Mandy wept all over again. Matron called for Mandy at exactly 12 noon the following day. Mandy was packed and waiting for her, and she kept to her resolve to be brave. It was the hardest thing she had ever tried to do. Jonathan and Bill and Anne walked outside with her to the car. Mandy felt as though she were carrying around a big floating bag of sadness inside of her. It was so full that she thought it must surely burst at any moment. Matron voiced for Mandy some of the things she wanted to say to Bill and Anne. "Thank you so much for having her. I know it has just been the most wonderful time, hasn't it, Mandy?" Mandy nodded. She forced her eyes wide apart so that the tears would not show. The strain was nearly unbearable, and her throat was aching horribly. She gave Anne a brief, fierce hug and managed to whisper, "Thank you for everything." She stared at the ground as she offered Jonathan her hand. Bye, Jonathan. Bye, Mandy. Hope to see you soon. Bill looked lovingly at the girl standing in front of him in such obvious emotional pain. He placed his hands on her head and pulled her close to his side. Mandy buried her face in his coat. They stood that way for a long moment. Come again soon, Mandy. Come and visit us often. We will miss you a lot. Mandy could only nod her head. She tried to summon a smile and gave a small hiccup of emotion. Bill quietly handed her his handkerchief and then moved to open the car door. Take care of her, matron. She's very special to us. Matron climbed into the car and Mandy followed. Her eyes were so full of tears that she could barely see. The car door slammed and the Fitzgerald family shouted their goodbyes. The car pulled away from the house, its tires crunching noisily on the ground. Mandy didn't look back. She sat stiffly on the edge of her seat and averted her head so that Matron could not see her. She gazed sadly out the window. Matron was saying, The children are terribly excited about your coming home, Mandy. You've no idea how much you were missed at Christmas. The car stopped at two big gates leading onto the main road. Mandy watched the gates swing wide to let the car through, and she felt a surge of bitter resentment toward Matron for taking her back to the orphanage. She felt as though she were a piece of baggage being shifted from one place to another. She had a sudden desire to jump out of the car and run far away from everyone. How wonderful it would be to live her own life, to be free to decide things for herself. The orphanage seemed smaller than Mandy remembered. It looked bleak and gray as they arrived. The only cheerful thing about it was the welcome of the children who came rushing out as the car pulled up to the front door. She was glad of the distraction. It momentarily took her mind away from the unhappiness that she felt. Mandy discovered that she was something of a celebrity. The children wanted to know every detail of her Christmas and her illness and her being away for so long. The attention was very flattering, but Mandy had no wish to talk about anything. She was achingly tired, and there were dark circles under her eyes. She found herself yawning, and Matron suggested that she go upstairs for an afternoon rest. Sue carried Mandy's case up to the attic, and she chattered happily as Mandy undressed for bed. I'm so glad you're back, Mandy. It was terribly quiet here without you. Christmas was really lonely. Mandy gazed around the familiar attic room. It was so different from the large, airy bedroom she had occupied at Cranton House. She wished she could be in that quiet, peaceful room at this very moment. She took from her case the brown teddy bear that Jonathan had given her and climbed into bed. I've got masses to tell you, Sue said. Will you show me your Christmas presents when you get up? Mandy smiled and nodded wearily. She touched the signet ring on her finger and gazed at it lovingly. A deep sadness overcame her, and she pulled the bear close and held it tightly. She cuddled down beneath the covers, pulling the sheet up over her head. Sue, sensing Mandy's mood, wisely left the room and pulled the door to a close behind her.